It was inevitable that the SEC and the Big Ten would throw their weight around with regards to the future of the college football playoff to benefit themselves. That has made 2025 for the Big 12 and BYU all the more imperative that they go out and put on a show.
You are Locked On Cougars, your daily podcast on the BYU Cougars, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What's up, everybody? I'm Jake Hatch, your host here on Locked On Cougars, resident BYU insider. Thank you for making Locked On Cougars your first listen of the day, and more importantly, thank you to all of you who like to call our everydayers right here on your original daily podcast focused on the BYU Cougars. Coming up on today's show, we talk about the future of the college football playoff and how it relates to BYU and the Big 12. We'll also talk about how former BYU AD Rondo Fehlberg says BYU is the, quote, big dog, unquote, of the Big 12. And then we'll finish up today's show with some basketball thoughts with the Phil the 68 guys saying the BYU is, quote, the most dangerous team outside the top 25 currently. All right, so biggest thing to take away for right now is there's meetings going on between the Big Ten and the SEC that they are essentially trying to force their will upon the future of college football and, more importantly, the college football playoff. Now, the original reports were that they were going to obviously force themselves into the discussion when it came to 2026, when the college football playoff came up for renewal with regards to its contract. They were going to force the changes then, potentially going to 14 teams, making it so they had at least 4 automatic bids for both of those leagues, 8 in all, so more than half of the field would favor those two leagues. But now the reports are that Greg Sankey and Tony Petitti, the respective commissioners of the SEC and the Big Ten, are trying to force those changes for this year in 2025. Now, to make any changes to the college football playoff format for 2025, you have to have all 10 college conference commissioners, as well as Notre Dame AD, I forget what his name is, Pete Bekwava. They've got to sign off on this, and it's got to be 11-0. You can't have a majority, a super majority. It's got to be unanimous. The simple fact of the matter is, if the SEC and the Big Ten want to force these changes right now in the Big 12, they're going to have to concede something. They're going to have to give something up for the Big 12 and the SEC to get on board with that, as well as the other G5 conferences and obviously Notre Dame as well. I look at this circumstance, and if I'm the Big 12, I'm playing hardball with those fools. I am making sure that they are going to pay through the nose if they want to force their future and what they envision the future being of college football, which benefits, let's be honest, the SEC and the Big Ten. If they're going to do that, you're going to get something out of it. The biggest point I want to make that relates to BYU is 2025 is now a season that the Big 12 and BYU is one of the top teams with top talent returning in the Big 12. It has got to be time to put on a show. The Big 12 can't be cannibalizing itself this year where they're only getting Arizona State into the college football playoff field. They can't be out there struggling to garner eyeballs. Everything that the Big 12 and BYU by extension has to do this season needs to put the glitz and glamour and the spotlight on the Big 12 and make them respected in the national media's eyes. Too often, the national media is going to have the stars in their eyes with regards to the Big Ten and the SEC. That's just inevitable because they have got overtures and other incentives to pay attention to those two leagues and to write more about them. That is imperative now that the Big 12 force themselves, inject themselves into that national conversation. And the way to do that, you got to have a team like BYU as well as one or two others, whether that's Iowa State, Arizona State reprising its role as Big 12 champion, an upstart like Texas Tech. You've got to have some premier teams step forward and become the big dogs of the Big 12 this season and put on a show. BYU's schedule is not wholly unmanageable. The only game that I look at and say, man, I am not happy about the way that they scheduled that is the fact that BYU, after they host Utah in mid-October for homecoming and the annual rivalry game, they immediately turn around and make the trek to Ames, Iowa to face off against Iowa State. That feels like, in many respects, the toughest and maybe the most likely, quote, scheduled loss, unquote, if you want to call it that BYU has on their schedule. If BYU could put on an 11-1 season, make a run of the college football playoff, make a run of the Big 12 title game that they came oh so close to a year ago, if they could pull all that off, that would go a long way to helping elevate the overall look of the Big 12 and, more importantly, essentially tell the powers that be out there in the college football universe, yeah, you may think that you run this in speaking of the SEC and the Big Ten, but we are still going to be heard from, speaking of the Big 12, and in this case, BYU. It is very, very important that this season is not wasted by Brett Yormark, by Tom Holmoe. Now, he will be replaced at that point, but Kalani Sitake, all of the coaches and players in the BYU football program, they have got a ton of talent, a ton of production returning this year, and they need to focus on making sure that they do not slip up. BYU was really good a season ago with regards to handling as a one-game season every single week. You'd hear the players, typical refrain when we'd ask them, hey, what do you think about the potential of a game down the line? Focus on the here and now. Focused on this week. They've got to maintain that focus. It's not easy to do, and you have to have very, very good leadership to lead you through that. And two of BYU's chief leaders a season ago, vocal leaders who helped lead the way on that, and speaking of Tyler Batty and Connor Pay, well, they're off to the NFL. So who steps forward now and becomes those voices in the meeting rooms and says, guys, focus on what we've got at hand, whether it's the opener against Portland State, whether it's the rivalry game against Utah, whether it's another major showdown against a fellow Big 12 team that may be ranked in the top 25 or better. The focus has to be game by game and understanding that, not to add undue pressure to BYU, but the Big 12 needs a good showing from some of its bigger and better teams this season, just to make sure that the powers that be don't feel like they can steamroll the rest of college football and have it bend its collective will to theirs. And once again, I'm talking about the Big Ten and the SEC. It feels still inevitable that the future of college football revolves around those two leagues because they have the most power brands, they have the most money, they have the most expensive TV contracts. They've got all that going for them. But that doesn't mean that the Big 12 cannot inject itself into the national conversation. And the only way you can do that is by having teams win big, win early, and win a lot. And BYU has every opportunity to be one of those teams this season for the Big 12 conference. And quite frankly, I'm hoping they live up to the hype. I expect BYU at worst to be a top 4 preseason team in the Big 12. They may be the outright favorite in some people's eyes with regards to the amount of talent returning, what they did a season ago at 11-2, but you can't afford to go 10-2, miss out on a Big 12 title game, and have the national conversation be like, yeah, that team's cute and all, and then the post-mortem on the season was like, well, why didn't we respect BYU more? Well, guess what? No slip-ups. You can't have the Kansas game happen to you this year. I'm not saying this is just BYU's burden to bear in the Big 12. They need other Big 12 schools to do this, and they've got to strike really early on in the season with major wins and do so in pretty impressive fashion. And I know that kind of goes against Kalani Sitake's whole MO, because he's a guy who's like, if I win the game, that's all that matters to me. Style points matter, and they may matter more than ever this year for BYU in the Big 12. And I hope that they can understand that, yes, at times it can come off as being haughty or coming off as being, hey, overbearing. But in this circumstance, with regards to watching the college football future go the way of what the Big Ten and the SEC want it to go, you still need to make sure that you have a place at the table. And the way to do that is to force the national conversation to include BYU, to include the Big 12. And fingers crossed, it pays off down the road when they do pay attention and you put on a performance for the ages, hopefully in 2025. All right, coming up next, we're going to continue to talk BYU football, but kind of building off what we just talked about. Former BYU AD Rondo Fehlberg had a pretty bold statement of what he thinks BYU should be in their new conference home. And is it too much to think that BYU can be what he likes to say, the big dog? We'll talk about that next right here on Locked On Cougars. Today's show is brought to you by our friends over at Roy. Attention Cougar fans, the future of college sports, it's here, and it is fully transparent. Before the Roy app, NIL negotiations often happen under the table. Fans didn't have a clear way on having a chance to directly support the athletes they love. Now with Roy, you get to be a part of the change and support BYU athletes in the most transparent way possible. Roy, the NIL app allows you to A, choose the player you want to support, B, decide how much to contribute to that player, and C, receive exclusive content from the athletes you BYU back, obviously, to make up the NIL deal. The best part is your player transfers. You get your money back. It's a risk-free way to show your support for these athletes. The Roy app is giving fans control, no more uncertainty. Now you can provide transparent, impactful support and help shape team and future of college sports with your contributions, and obviously help BYU by extension. Download the Roy app now from the App Store and start backing BYU athletes the way that they deserve, with transparency, trust, and obviously a real impact with dollars going to them. This is the future of college sports. Join it now by downloading the Roy app and support your favorite players today. Once again, get the Roy app wherever you get your apps, on the App Store or Google Play Store, and get started today with our friends over at Roy. Thank you once again for making Locked On Cougars your first listen of the day. Hope you all are doing well out there. All right, so on my radio show that I work for, the KSL Sports Zone, I'm the executive producer of DJ and PK, and I've been in that role for 10 years plus now. Well, we have had many a conversation with former BYU Athletic Director Rondo Fehlberg. And in the aftermath of Tom Holmoe's announcement that he's stepping down from his position and retiring as BYU Athletic Director, we had Rondo on the show last week. And a statement he made during that interview has started to catch a little bit of fire with regards to what it means for BYU. And he said that he was very surprised that a BYU booster, was it Paul Lillianquist, I think it was his name, essentially said that we will not be outbid. And he said it absolutely floored him. It surprised him that a BYU booster would make such a bold statement, because as Rondo says, BYU needs to understand that they are, what he says, the big dog of the Big 12. That's the direct quote, big dog of the Big 12. But Rondo also cautioned, saying that BYU doesn't want to be out there, as he says, pounding their chest and saying, hey, we are that big dog. You want others, whether it's people inside the Big 12, whether it's people in the national media, your rival, whoever it may be, you want them to make that statement for you, speaking of BYU. I found that very interesting, because Rondo obviously presided over BYU during an era where they were the big dog of the WAC and the Mountain West Conference. BYU controlled those leagues and really had run of the shop for long stretches of their runs in those respective two conferences. They went independent for a spell. They had their opportunities in the West Coast Conference, but never really could get over the hump against the likes of Gonzaga in that league. So I'm thinking that Rondo may be coming from a place where he is still reflecting on where BYU was in the 1980s, 1990s, early 2000s, and may not be where BYU is right now. I believe the answer to Rondo Fehlberg's question is yes and no. And that sounds like a cop-out, and I completely understand why you think it's a cop-out. But here's the deal. BYU has the potential to be a big dog, to use that quote once again, to be a big dog of the Big 12. But are they there right now? I don't think so. I think BYU in their heart of hearts understands that in time they could become the big dog of the Big 12, but it's going to take a lot of hard work. It's going to take a lot of results. It's going to take a lot of investment, NIL, all the different features of what college sports represents right now and what it requires to succeed at a high level. That is all in the potential for BYU. If they can continue to have the results they've had on the football field right now, on the basketball court, an 11-2 football campaign, right now a BYU basketball team that's trending towards maybe getting a single-digit seed in the NCAA tournament. Kevin Young looks like he's got a really good thing building with BYU basketball. If they can continue to build on that, that doesn't even negate what BYU's other sports are doing. Speaking of women's soccer, baseball, softball, men's and women's volleyball, the tennis programs, swim and dive, track and field, cross country, or national champions. They have got a ton of athletics programs that can make national noise in their respective spheres and could help BYU emerge as that big dog. But is BYU the big dog right now in the Big 12? I don't think they are. That's where the no comes in to my conversation. BYU understands their place in the Big 12, and they understand what they're striving to build within the conference. Rondo's right. The BYU wants the rest of the world to tell them, hey, that BYU, they're that Leviathan out there in the Big 12. But it's going to take time to become that for them to say that. He admitted, speaking of Rondo, that it's going to ruffle feathers of the Big 12 for him to make such a statement, and I understand why it would, because it sounds better than thou, that type of stuff with regards to BYU that already has a reputation as a church-affiliated school. Having that reputation, it gets shoved in BYU fans' faces by their rivals all the time that you guys think you're better than us. But all that stuff exists out there. BYU has every resource on the table and in reserve that it could unleash to become that juggernaut, Leviathan, big dog of the Big 12 Conference, but they're not quite there yet. The track record suggests that BYU is on the right path because, as I mentioned, the big two sports that really lead the way are off to really, really solid starts in the Big 12. Obviously, football stumbled out of the gate going 5-7, but bounced back with a really impressive 11-2 season last year. And we just talked about the fact that I feel like BYU has got a major opportunity in 2025 to go out and really show what they're capable of to the nation. And if they can do that, that starts to put together that, hey, BYU may be emerging as one of the forces in this conference. And as you build upon that, the recruiting, the investment, the NIL, all the different machinations that would lend itself to BYU emerging as the major player in the Big 12 Conference, they're all on the table right now. Basketball is in the same circumstance. Mark Pope had a really, really fantastic debut season in the Big 12 when expectations were really low. Obviously, expectations were raised a little bit this year with Kevin Young taking over, and they have, I think, exceeded them to this point, albeit some of you may have had unrealistic expectations because of the investment in NIL, the recruiting that Kevin Young has been doing, obviously the additions he's made via recruiting and the like. But if this can be a proven track record, if you can start to put together and build upon the successes that you're having with BYU sports, yeah, in time, BYU will become that big dog in the conference, and they will have those other people saying it for them, even though it'll be through clenched teeth, and they'll be more complaining about the fact that BYU is that proverbial big dog versus them being that. There has been a power vacuum at the top of the Big 12 since Oklahoma and Texas exited the league after they joined the SEC. And it's going to take time for one or two or three teams to really emerge as those power programs in this new look Big 12. But there is no reason to think that Rondo Feldberg is wrong in saying that BYU is a big dog. He is right in the belief that BYU can get there. But for him to say that BYU is, I think is a little haughty. I think it's a little over the top to say they is his present term, if you forget what I'm going with. Whereas I think BYU could be in time. Hopefully that delineation is more clear. They have everything on the table for BYU sports. And with the added investment and the overall investment and the interest from BYU's collective donor base, we're talking the Ryan Smiths of the world and on down to the lowest of the low Cougar Club members, the investments have been coming in hot and heavy for BYU. And so long as those investments are used in the right way, they're invested strategically, and they benefit BYU obviously in the form of wins on the gridiron, on the basketball court, or whatever other sporting venue or apparatus you want to talk about. BYU in time can emerge as that team that will have the rest of the nation, the rest of the Big 12 talking about them, and they won't have to go out there, puff out their chest, and say what they're doing. The one thing Rondo also said is that the next Big 12, not the next Big 12, the next BYU athletic director, they have to take the momentum that Tom Homo has built up in the lead up to getting into the Big 12, what they've created through the first 2 years, and he cannot let it fall by the wayside. So whether it is a Brian Santiago, whether it is somebody from the outside that takes over as BYU AD, their marching orders are clear. Build upon this. Don't let it fall flat. If you let it fall flat, then BYU will never become the big dog of the Big 12 because it's hard to regain the momentum that BYU is established right now. And if you let it fall by the wayside, that would be a major disappointment and would negate everything that Tom Homo, Rondo Feldberg, Val Hale, Glenn Tuckett, on down the list of the great BYU ADs of yesteryear, Elaine Michaelis, etc. All of that would have fallen by the wayside if BYU becomes the doormat of the Big 12 versus the big dog. All right, we'll finish up today's show with some thoughts on BYU basketball. A national publication is saying BYU is, quote, the most dangerous, unquote, team outside the top 25 right now. Are they right in that assessment? We'll talk about that next, coming up on Locked On Cougars. Thank you once again for making Locked On Cougars your first listen of the day. Another just note for you guys, if you're interested in doing so, please sign up for the Locked On Cougars Insider Group. Supports the show, obviously, and everything I am doing and what we're doing with the podcast, but more importantly, get you the inside scoop on everything I'm hearing on BYU sports, all for just $5 a month. Now, the best part is the kicker. Get 2 full weeks, a half a month free before you pay anything to be part of the Locked On Cougars Insider Group. So if you're interested in doing so, getting those updates on what I'm hearing about BYU sports, join us today. The link is in the show notes below, whether you're watching this and or listening to it. There's a hyperlink there. Click on it, sign up today, and be a part of the Locked On Cougars Insider Group. All right. So the Field of 68 got a lot of really good guys talking college basketball every single day. Rob Doster, John Fanta, is Jeff Goodman part of it? They've got a really, really strong cast of characters when it comes to the college basketball world. And they did a podcast. I don't remember when it released. Maybe it released yesterday, calling BYU, quote, the most dangerous team, unquote, outside the big top 25 right now in college basketball. That comes on the heels after they absolutely just demolished the Kansas Jayhawks. And I want to agree with them. But the bigger question I have is, you don't want to be peaking right now. It's great to be like I said, the most dangerous team outside the top 25 right now. But really, what does it mean if BYU peaks right now, gets into the big dance, and falls flat on their face like they did against Duquesne a season ago? It's going to be looked at as a disappointment. I would rather BYU continue to kind of fly under the radar right now and continue to kind of collectively build towards the Big 12 tournament and obviously go into the NCAA tournament and maybe be a little bit overlooked once again, but over exceed expectations versus once again being a disappointment with a one and done situation. Call me crazy, but that's what I think BYU would be best served to have. I understand why the Field of 68 guys are saying this about BYU, and for good reason, because Scott Van Pelt said that BYU should have a number next to their name in the aftermath of that Kansas game. By the way, how cool was it to see BYU front and center across that sports center? SVP Sports Center, if I'm not mistaken, it may have changed. I still believe it's the highest rated sports center across the entire ESPN family of networks. So most eyeballs are on it. And BYU got featured prominently. Kevin Young was doing a post-game interview right there on the floor at the Marriott Center with SVP. You had him talking about, like I said, BYU should have a number next to their name. They did a highlight package later that if it was not 90% BYU highlights, it was 80 at worst. It was really, really cool to see BYU front and center with regards to what SVP and ESPN were doing for them in the aftermath of that win against Kansas. It was a resounding win, and it resounds across the country. People sat up and was like, hold on, what did BYU do to Kansas? I've got a family member who is a Utah fan who sent me a text and said, what in the world got into BYU? And we were going back and forth, and I was like, quite honestly, I don't know, but it was really fun to watch. And that's the thing about this. This BYU team, they're really coming to their own right now. But once again, I don't want them peaking right now. I don't want them. They could go and beat Arizona and obviously have the nation talking about, wow, this BYU team, what are they doing? How good could they be? All of that will fall by the wayside if you get into the big dance as, let's say, a 5 or a 6 seed in that circumstance and lose once again in the first round. I want to see BYU over exceed expectations versus you get what I'm talking about. You want to see BYU do better than the expectations have for them. And that Kansas game kind of put them on the map where they're in a little bit of an uncomfortable circumstance right now because they're now well off the bubble. They should be challenging for a single digit seed, whether it's a 7, 8, or a 9 seed based on prognostications when it comes to March Madness. But I am concerned that if they're being called the most dangerous team outside the top 25 right now, they may be building a little bit of a momentum here that could hurt them in the end. Maybe I'm crazy about this, and I welcome all feedback as always. I do appreciate good, bad, or indifferent your guys' thoughts on the podcast. It really does help me kind of drive the show forward. Some of you have said that I need to talk more basketball with basketball season, but I get all that. But the bigger point I want to make about BYU basketball is, yes, it's good to be loved right now. It's good to see BYU being mentioned as one of those teams that you want to look out for when it comes to March Madness. But it all goes for naught if you cannot win in March Madness. I say this all the time, and it's no fun to talk about this for BYU, but until they shed the moniker of having the most NCAA tournament appearances without a Final Four appearance, that's going to be a shadow that continues to hover over them in the college basketball universe. I don't know what it's going to take for BYU to ultimately break into the top 25 right now, considering they had a pretty paltry non-conference slate, and really the big games they had in the non-conference, they lost. So it may be too much ground to make up right now with the national pollsters in the AP top 25 to see BYU get ranked at this point in the season. But I don't care about that. Being ranked's great and all. Having a number next to your name, that's awesome. And BYU, maybe by next week, they are ranked. Maybe the national media does rank them. But I would rather BYU continue to kind of silently go about their business and continue to build what has become a pretty dangerous team. When BYU's on, as they were against Kansas, that's a mighty dangerous team. Bill Self was not, I think, bloviating when he said that BYU could beat anybody tonight. That's a Kansas team, speaking of the Jayhawks, that beat Duke and Cooper Flag on a neutral court 2 months ago. So it was a thorough beating that BYU administered to Kansas, and Bill Self sat up and paid attention, as well as hundreds, if not thousands, of other media members / fans across the country saying, BYU did what to the Kansas Jayhawks? Because people just don't do that. And I didn't notice this until after I did my postcast. You just know that Kansas is the only team that had not suffered a 30-plus point loss to a non-ranked team since the AP poll era started in 1948, 1949. They were the only team across college basketball who had never absorbed that, and BYU handed that to them and said, hey, here you go. It was a really, really fun night, but it was one night. You have to follow that up. You got a really, really big showdown against Arizona on Saturday night, and it doesn't get any easier. You have Arizona State, you got Iowa State out there. You obviously have a final finale against Utah down at the Marriott Center to get payback for the loss in Salt Lake City. There is still a lot of pitfalls that BYU still could find themselves in down the stretch of the Big 12 season. So yes, right now the love is great and all, but understand it's for one game, and it's only going to last so long as you continue to put together quality wins. You may lose against Arizona, and that will sting a little bit, but I think the national media gets it. You split 2 top 25 opponents in 1 week. That's pretty impressive stuff. But the bigger point to be made is love is good right now, but you want the ultimate love to come in the form of NCAA tournament high bursts and obviously wins in the big dance. Those matter a whole lot more than anything else you could muster right now with regards to BYU basketball. Once again, I may be crazy, but calling them the most dangerous team outside the top 25, that's great and all, but I'd like to see them go out there and win a second round game and go to the Sweet 16. That's what I want to see from BYU basketball. Beating Kansas in the regular season is awesome, and demolishing them in the way that they did, all great stuff. But I'm withholding judgment because I want to see this BYU basketball team, because it sure looks like they're headed to the big dance. I want to see them put on a better performance than they did a season ago, and quite literally better performance than they've put on for more than a decade at this point, because it's been a pretty rough go of things outside of first-round wins in Dayton against Iona that required a monumental comeback. BYU's NCAA tournament history recently, not so good. So that's more of where I'm looking at what I will consider a success for BYU. And once again, I welcome the feedback on anything we've talked about on today's show. So with that said, that'll do it for this edition of Locked On Cougars. Please subscribe, rate, review, share with your family and friends. You have your Uncle Larry out there who's a big Cougar fan. Tell them about this podcast. It's BYU content every single day. And as always, thank you for all the support. The love you guys support, the love you guys give to the podcast, the support you give it. It truly does mean the world to me and everything else we're building with this community. But once again, thank you for making Locked On Cougars your first listen of the day. And as always, thank you for making Locked On Cougars a part of your day and being everydayers with us right here on the podcast.